this is for my media and crime presentation. I'm just going to be doing a short little video on it and talking about it a little bit in class. But my papers were on 3 different things. The first was fictional, and it was The Last of Us. It is a video game that takes place after this pandemic apocalypse, but regardless. The point being looked at in there was an organization called Fedra, which is this police government organization kind of left over after the collapse of everything. Well, anyway, they have advanced military equipment, tanks, full arsenals of military equipment, same stuff that, our National Guard has right now. But anyway, they use that to kind of authoritarian control, hold this authoritarian control over the people in this universe, in this series. And so I found that interesting. I first looked into why this was done this way for the TV show, and it was definitely emphasized more in the TV show than it was in the actual video game. And I thought that this was in part due to current climate around police. There's this kind of anti-police sentiment throughout society today. So going off that anti-police sentiment, we kind of see this idea that people are bringing up more into question, why do police have these military equipment and so on and so forth. So that brings me into my nonfiction representation of this, which were 2 different YouTube videos. The first going into kind of the history of police militarization, which I found very interesting, because up until a certain point in history, military organizations, standing militaries of countries were what acted as the police force. And only until 1895 did we see our first legitimate police force in the United States, which was New York City Police, or the New York Police Department, NYPD. But regardless, we before that had just used militaries, but there then came an idea that we need to separate this, because military is for protection of our sovereign nation and not really control over the citizens. So it was thought that we need to start moving away from using militaries, and at first they were using private organizations, such as the Pinkertons in the United States. These were private organizations that acted as law enforcement for, mining companies, for cattle companies, cattle yards. So it kind of progressed into this, okay, now we have individual sheriffs all over the place, so we don't need these private organizations. We just have the sheriff that's in control of this small town or this small area. And as time went on throughout the United States, we saw organized crime during Prohibition. This kind of led to police departments being everywhere. Every single town had a police department, and every police department had guns in it to be able to fight this rise of organized crime that came with the prohibition of alcohol. So, with Prohibition being a big thing, we saw, criminals getting more and more guns, criminals having more and more money because they came together and they were able to then fund their own equipment. And so we saw police organizations then having to get more equipment. And this was kind of the theme and how things were until you get to the 90s. Like things were on the steady increase. Crime, got more perpetuated as technology advanced. So did the technology of the criminals. And then you get to the 90s, and what I'm looking at, particularly for police militarization, was during the LA riots, the police chief of the LAPD called in National Guard. He called in, these actual military organizations to help with this policing job. And that was our first instance of when we saw SWAT teams formed. The LA police chief back in the 90s was responsible for the formation of SWAT teams, and that was kind of the special weapons and tactics units were this like military high value hostage rescue kind of thing that the LAPD had to be able to deal with these intense situations. And I believe the one video talked about how after this, when LA was hosting the Olympic Games, they applied to get armored personnel carriers because they felt that they needed them to better protect the people of the Olympics. So they got these armored personnel carriers, and now we see this being a common theme, with SWAT teams driving up to a building in their big black truck and everybody hopping out and everything in this big armored vehicle. Well, that really started with the LAPD. And then we saw when Columbine happened, this perpetuation of like, holy crap, everyone needs one of these. Everyone needs a SWAT team to be able to deal with, these active shooters that have machine guns and bombs. So you really saw an explosion of SWAT teams forming around the country where, there hadn't been any. And it was over this idea that, we need this reaction. So government programs were formed and everything for surplus military equipment to then be given cheaply to these police departments, often for just shipping costs itself. The government says, hey, we'll give you this to help fight crime, and in turn you just have to pay shipping. Well, what we're seeing now is these things were being developed for these military-like situations, hostage rescue, or big large gunfights and all this stuff. Now we just see them mainly being used in the execution of drug warrants. Nowadays, most of the use of SWAT teams is for going in and busting down the door of a drug dealer's house and making sure that they don't, flush any evidence, and getting in there as quickly as possible to kind of gather it all up. So we're seeing this takeaway from this, prestigious, lethal, well-oiled machine tactics unit that was supposed to be for the protection and for quick responses, being used for drug responses. And this is particularly being called into question nowadays with the rise in mass shootings. Why do we have all these SWAT teams all over the place with this police military equipment, and it is not being used for fast response times? We saw in Uvalde 40 minutes. We see in Tennessee recently, it was just the plainclothes, or not the plainclothes police officers, but the police officers that went in and shot the suspect. These SWAT units that are being heavily funded and heavily used aren't being used for their original purpose. So it's just very interesting. And those were kind of the themes throughout this, is why are we using these things and spending a lot of money on these departments and these tactics units when it's not being used for, this level of crime that we think we have. It's being just used for drugs, which is, a question that has been raised with a lot of people with policing. Is this military-like police unit being used as like a fly swatter a real big moral issue or an ethical issue? So that's my overall presentation. This was a lot to kind of go through quickly. I could talk probably a half hour on it, but I instead kept it shorter. I hope that this was all legible and understandable, but I hope everyone has a good semester and enjoy it.